He has, by his own intellectual activity, energy, and ability, has probably single-handedly been responsible for the reversal of many major trends in the field of economics. He has done this despite the fact that for the society at large there are probably prejudicial associations with some of his political views. Mr. Friedman is an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism. He supported such people as Barry Goldwater. Still, this man, because of his intellectual achievements and his ability, has been able to persuade large numbers of people about the values of capitalism and to change their views about monetary theory. Dr. Friedman is not going to give a lecture here tonight. He's of the opinion that many libertarians are familiar with his views. Instead, we decided we would have a conversation with Milton Friedman in which the audience would participate. What we are going to do is we are going to take questions from the audience. I prefer people to write these questions down. However, after we exhaust written questions, we will take other questions, and we've received from some while. During the course of this part, we will try if we can get the connection through, we will be taking a call or two from California, and a portion of this talk will be brought to California. Don?
We have California on the line, but they are not getting that mic. It's here from here. Is the button switch?
What button?
Push the button. There's one for Mom now.
Okay. There's a history major, right?
Hello? Yeah, we can hear you at the audience now, but Gary needs to say the mic.
I would say something.
How about this? Can it be heard now?
We can hear you very lightly. You got to speak really loud.
It's pretty tough to do that. I'll try.
Are you speaking over the telephone or are you speaking over a microphone?
Speaking into a microphone.
Is there another microphone there? Because this microphone that you have is a typical New York microphone.
Let me hasten to add, the phone company here has been on strike.
Is your garbage being collected?
Only in the form of political speeches.
The highest we can go here, so whoever is speaking is going to have to speak what you're doing right now, but it's going to have to speak at least that loud, and everyone here will be quiet.
At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Friedman.
Thank you, Mr. Gary. I'm glad to be here, and I'm also glad to be able to talk at long distance to all those people in California. Did you want to start by... Gary said he was going to start by asking the first question. You see, he's the youngest person in the house, and it's the night before Passover.
Why is this wage price freeze different from any other? My question is, would you comment, 1, on the morality of the current wage price freeze, and 2, on whether or not you think Phase 2 will be effective?
We can't hear you in California.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but speak up louder or because we're getting it like you're 10 feet away from the microphone.
We'll have to do the best. I'll try to talk loud if I can.
That's good. Okay.
Okay. The first question was, what do I think about the morality of wage and price controls? Those of you who are in New York and are subjected to the indignity of having to read the New York Times every day, may have seen that I wrote 2 articles in the New York Times op-ed section a week ago, a little over a week ago, in which I argued that the wage price controls did not seem to me to be moral, that they seemed to me to violate our basic views. Now let me emphasize, from the point of view of many people who are here, who will take a rather extreme anarchist libertarian philosophy, the mere fact that these are governmental measures makes them immoral per se. My position, that's a tenable position. It's not one that I happen to hold. I would be delighted if it turned out to be possible at some future date to have a world without any government whatsoever. The ideal of a strictly anarchist society is an excellent ideal, but I do not believe myself that it is a feasible or tenable ideal. I hope you can prove me wrong. At any rate, that needn't detain us, because we have a long, long way to go before the issues that separate the libertarian anarchists and myself come into the realm of reality. At the moment, so when I say that I believe the price and wage controls are immoral, it's not in that simple tautological sense. It's for a very different reason. It's because I do believe that they involve the substitution of arbitrary rules of men for some kind of a rule of law. That instead of my being able to go to a law book or to a statement reflecting the passage of legislation by duly constituted representatives, by some means of representation, and see whether I may charge 5 cents extra or not, I have to ask 7 people who are on a pay board, who have been appointed to that position, whether I may do so. And moreover, they are going to profess to tell me about things that I may or may not do, that so far as one can see affect primarily myself and the other people I negotiate with. It seems to me I can see no difference in principle between the objections that have been widely raised in this country to the expropriation of the copper mines in Chile without adequate compensation, with the Chilean government saying to Anaconda Copper, you owe us X hundred millions of dollars for taxes we didn't assess in the past but should have, and that more than covers the value of your property here, and therefore we take your property for nothing. I can see no difference between the morality of that, which it seems to me is highly immoral, and the morality of the pay board telling my employer that he may not pay me a wage which he is perfectly willing to pay me and which I am willing to receive. I am being forced, the employee in that case is being forced to sell his property at a lower price than he and his willing buyer will agree to, because a governmental official has said, has expropriated, if you wish to put it that way, that part of his pay. This is one aspect which seems to me to make it immoral, that it involves the use of coercion without the controls of a legal structure, without a constitutional or other legal provision for controlling people. And that's the sense in which I believe it is immoral. I believe it will have immoral consequences, which is a rather different thing, because it encourages individuals to cheat, to lie, to spy on one another, and to be informers on one another. The essence of a really free market is that people who participate in a voluntary exchange all benefit from it. They mutually benefit. The buyer benefits and the seller benefits. Now the big brother comes along and he says to you, you can benefit by spying on your grocery store and telling us that they've charged 28 cents for artichokes when they should have charged 24 cents. I'm not enough of an agricultural economist to know if those prices are at all real. They're purely artificial. So that people are encouraged to spy on one another, to report to the public, and moreover, they are obviously encouraged to break the law. It is in the mutual interest of people to make contracts which are now going to be illegal. Well, when that happens, fortunately, and it is one of the great defenses of a free society, it's the ingenuity of people in getting around laws that prevent them from doing things which are in their self-interest. And the result of this will be that you will have a widespread set of evasions, avoidances, and so on. More serious the longer the time that the thing lasts. Now, there are lots else I could say about it. I think it's one of the things that has impressed me about newspaper coverage of the Phase 2 is the extent to which they have spoken about a 15-member board which has 5 labor representatives and 5 employer representatives. That's sloppy reporting. There are no labor representatives on the board whatsoever. There are 5 labor union representatives. It's not at all clear that those representatives even represent their members. But even if we assume that they do, members of trade unions account for less than 1 in 4, less than 25% of the American working force. So you have 75% of the workers who are not represented in any way by the people designated labor members. You have 5 so-called employer or management representatives. That is, again, not factually accurate. Those men, every one of them represents a large enterprise. You have one who is from General Electric, one who is the president of a railroad. I don't know in detail the others, but my impression is that not a single one of them can in any way be said to be a representative of the mom and pop grocery stores or of the small millions of individual enterprises that are scattered around the country. So again, you have 5 representatives of large business. If you're going to have representation, they deserve to be represented. I'm not quarreling with that. But you have the residual, perhaps 60% of employers who are not represented at all. So you have 5 representatives of 25% of the workers, 5 representatives of perhaps 25 or 30 or 40% of the employers. And then you have 5 public members who presumably represent 75% of the workers, 60% of the employers, and 100% of the consumers. That's what you call a fair, even representation. But now let me go to the second question. How effective will it be? That's a much more complicated question because it depends on what you mean by effective. In one sense, in my opinion, it will be very effective in the year 1972. The machinery doesn't agree with me. I can see that the science fiction addicts have been getting at all this electronics. It'll be very effective in the following sense, that if the fact is that there's very little pressure for the pay board or the price board to offset so far as 1972 is concerned. The rate of inflation was tapering off before the new economic policy was established. It had already come down to about 4% per year for consumer prices by June and July of this calendar year. If there had been no new economic policy at all, in my opinion, you would have continued to have something of a slowdown in the rate of price increase. You would have continued to have a tapering off of inflation. It would not have continued indefinitely. You already had expansionary pressures in there, so I expected a resumption of some accelerating inflation sometime in 72. But for 72 as a whole, you still would have had a lower rate of inflation than you did it for 71. Now, the goal of the new board is to have a 2 to 3% rate of inflation as measured by the computed price index numbers by the end of 1972, that is, by the last quarter of 72. Well, as I say, if you had had no pay board or price board whatsoever and nothing else had happened, you had just gone on, you probably would have been very close to that anyway. But in addition, if you just had the pay board and the price board, and if they approved every single request that came to them, without question, you would succeed in that objective. And the reason is because you are the mere existence of these boards introduces a difference between prices that are really charged and prices that are reported. If you're a businessman and you want to raise your price, you will first use all indirect means of doing so. Namely, you will cut out commissions, concessions, special services, reduce quality, etc., before you ask the pay board for an explicit rise in your price. And therefore, the requests to the Price and Pay Board will already be less than the actual changes in prices, and therefore the index numbers that record prices are going to show an improvement whatever happens to the real rate of inflation. So in my opinion, now they will do a little more than that, not much, because in fact, as you can see from the actions already taken, the main decisions of the Pay Board have been essentially that they are not going to interfere very much with the prices and pay that people arrangements they wish to make. But they'll do a little more, and that will have the cosmetic effect of reducing the rate of rise of the price index. So in that sense of effectiveness for the year 1972, they will appear to be effective. I predict that in October, November, December of 1972, many people will be saying to me and to others like me who objected to the program, you see, you were wrong. All we had to do to get inflation down was to get off that absurd nonsense about no interference in private price and wage decisions. And the moment we set up a price and wage board, lo and behold, we got rid of inflation. However, I don't believe that 1972 will be the end of the story. That's the easy part. That's the honeymoon. That's the part when the pressures aren't building up. But under cover of these price and wage controls, in my opinion, the basic inflationary forces will build up in the form of more rapid monetary expansion, fueled by fiscal deficits. And then beginning in about 1973, you will really start to come to the crunch when the pressure will be present. Now, all I'm doing is telling you the story of other episodes of this kind. If you want to know whether an incomes policy has appeared to be successful, there's only one question you need to ask. That's how old is it? If the answer is that it's less than 1 year old, you can say it has appeared to be successful. If the answer is it's more than 2 years old, you can say it has collapsed. That's the life history of these controls, and so I think in 1973, that will be the real period when you will see the crunch and when you will see before the end of the year the controls collapse, as I hope. Here's a question. Do you consider it in contemporary American society feasible and moral to act illegally in the economic sphere, especially concerning wage and price controls, antitrust laws, and protective tariffs? Well, it's certainly feasible. One of the things I regard as most destructive of basic morality and social cohesion in programs like price and wage control is that they make it in the social interest for individuals to behave illegally. Now, I think a good society is one in which those laws which you do have, those governmental controls and regulations which you do have a very, very wide measure of agreement, in which the laws are limited so far as possible to those things where there is near unanimity. And I think it is destructive of social cohesion when people benefit society by behaving in ways that contradict the laws of the society. That was the effect on the social fabric of this society of prohibition in the 1920s. It is the effect today of many of the laws and regulations about the use of various kinds of drugs. These have the effect of undermining the degree of tolerance of one man for another and the respect for the legal structure. And I think they are destructive in that way of order and stability. And similarly, I think that the wage and price controls have this adverse effect. Now, so I say it's certainly feasible to act illegally in respect of wage and price controls and in respect of antitrust laws and protective tariffs. In fact, it's feasible to act illegally in respect to any law. I have yet to see that governmental regulation which was so perfectly enforced that it was not feasible to act in contravention to it. Whether it's moral, that's a much more difficult question. I think it does raise a real dilemma. I don't believe that morality consists in obeying any law. That's absurd. Nobody believes that. But neither, on the other hand, do I believe that morality consists in a willingness to disobey any law. That is, I think a good society is one in which we have managed to keep down the number of laws to a level and a scope so that people do regard it as moral to obey it. Question: how do you explain Arthur Burns' switch on the issue of wage and price control? If Arthur Burns were here, he would tell you that it was not a switch. He would tell you that the circumstance that he believes as fully as he ever did in what he wrote about the evils of wage and price control several years back. But he would say to you, and now I'm trying to present his view, it's not one that I agree with, but he would say to you that wage and price control are one thing when they are being used in a climate when the basic forces are inflation. He would say to you that what I wrote about before was a situation in which you had inflationary monetary and fiscal policy, in which excess demand was rising, and if under those circumstances, he said, you try to stop inflation by holding down wages and prices, the results of that will be wholly bad and will be what I said they were. He would then go on to say, the problem that we face in 1970 and 71 is a different one. He would say, we have tapered off the inflationary forces, we have produced a slowdown in the rate of monetary growth, we produced some fiscal restraint, and now, he said, there is a slowness in reaction to those which causes unemployment, and the public at large is not willing to tolerate the unemployment. And therefore, he would say to you, we have to find some way to speed up the transition to enable you to get from a position of inflation to a position of no inflation with smaller interim costs. And he would argue that price and wage controls are a way to do that by, in his opinion, preventing erroneous expectations about future inflation from being reflected in higher unemployment and continued inflation. That is the way he would justify it, and that is the way he would explain it. Okay. Do you believe that taxation must be enforced on anything other than a voluntary basis? Yes, I do. I believe... Well, I guess I should answer by saying... Is that really intellectual discussion? Okay, let's stick to intellectual discussion.
I hate to hear him, not you.
Well, let me see if I can answer this. I believe that it is necessary to have a government. And I believe that a government means a society in which there is some taxation, in which there is finance to it. I would like to see that limited to as small an area as possible. I would agree completely with the objectives of those who say they would like to see a world in which you could get by with nothing but a voluntary basis. The problem is that there are complexities in the world, in my opinion, which do not lend themselves to that kind of a solution. And those complexities are that we often are in a position to choose among evils. That there are some cases in which it is not possible to subject transactions to fully voluntary exchange. Now, the most obvious case of that in our society is national defense. National defense is a case in which you have the public good problem, the free rider problem, the problem that if you, through your voluntary contributions, pay for national defense, I get the benefit of it. And it is not technically feasible to make that transaction the subject of voluntary contract. All problems of the kind that are suggested by this question arise, in my opinion, from the fact that there is not enough fine print in the world. If there were enough fine print in the world and enough time to make the arrangements, it would in principle be possible to establish a whole series of voluntary contracts which would specify all of the further consequences in so much detail that they would be subject to that voluntary contract, such as the agreement that only those people will inhabit a certain society in an area who have agreed in advance before they have come there, that they will make certain contributions which they have voluntarily agreed to defense, and so on. And I think in point of fact, the world is one in which the costs of such arrangements are so high that the lesser evil in those cases is an agreement among people that they will accept the judgment of their representatives about paying taxes for these common public good problems. And that's the sense in which I believe that taxation under such circumstances must and will be enforced on other than a voluntary basis. Question: how do I reconcile the idea of laissez-faire with the monetarist theory of economics as is represented by the Chicago School? Does not the monetarist school presuppose a state monopoly on the production of money and money certificates? Well, that question confuses about four different things. It confuses science, it confuses economics with politics, and it confuses value judgments with analyses of particular arrangements. So the monetarist theory of economics, as it is represented by the Chicago School, insofar as I understand it, is a scientific theory. It says if A, then B. It says if, for whatever reason, the quantity of money increases in a certain way, it is likely to have such and such consequences. The monetarist theory is just as applicable to interpreting the consequences of a pure gold standard as it is to interpreting the consequences of a state-issued money. So we want to put to one side this absolutely scientific and in principle wertfrei aspect of our subject, which is the theory, a hypothesis, about how changes in the quantity of money affect the economy. Now, beyond that, many people who hold that view, people who are Chicago School monetarists in that scientific sense, hold very different views about desirable monetary policy. Some such people are believers in pure gold standards. Some such people are believers in pseudo-gold standards. Some such people are believers in paper standards. So the rest of this question comes down to how can I be so inconsistent as to favor laissez-faire on the one hand, and on the other hand, not to be in favor of an immediate movement toward a completely free gold standard. And the answer to that is that I believe it is important to distinguish a real honest-to-God gold standard from a fake or pseudo-gold standard. I wrote an article on this about a dozen years ago, which has been reprinted in my book, Dollars and Deficits, and which is entitled Real versus Pseudo Gold Standard, in which I expressed the view that I regarded either of two extremes as better than the middle. Either a real honest-to-God gold standard, in which gold was literally used as money, or, on the other hand, an honest-to-God paper standard, that either of those was better than the kind of fake gold standard we have been having for at least since 1933, and maybe then earlier, one in which you do not have a real gold standard, but what you have is government price fixing of gold. Now, with respect to the pure gold standard, the question is, how do you get it? I have consistently argued in favor of eliminating any prohibitions on the private ownership, buying, and selling of gold. I have consistently argued against what I think was a very mistaken Supreme Court decision in the 1930s, which rendered gold clauses unenforceable. It seems to me that the desirable thing in this area is to permit individuals to use whatever they separately want as money. And if private people want to use gold, if they want to engage in transactions their way, that's their business. Now the next question comes up, a very different question. Do you also want to go? The people who propose the pure gold standard are utterly inconsistent in their turn by wanting that to be established by government action. If you eliminated the restrictions which I am now describing, and if they are right about the superior merits of the gold standard, then it would emerge and survive. If they are wrong, and history suggests that they are wrong, then the gold standard would not in fact emerge, survive, and replace the paper standard. So the actual question you have, if you go along this path of first removing any obstacle to private people using whatever standard they want, the next question is, what ought government policy in this area to be? And there are various alternatives you can think of. But all of those alternatives, if government has some area, involve government issuing something which people use as money, these paper dollars we have in our pocket, the paper money. In this country, they have gone much farther than that. They have gone in the direction of a great deal of control over banks, over lending and investing and other transactions. And my own position is that the desirable thing to do would be to move to separate the operations of banks into those which consist of creating money, of transferring money, require that to operate under 100% reserves, and separate out the commercial lending and borrowing aspects of banks and allow that to operate completely free of any regulation. And then I would try to have the monetary powers, the powers of a government to emit money, be governed by essentially a constitutional arrangement under which they would be required to keep the quantity of money growing at a fixed rate, which whatever the question of number and so on, we can go into the details if anybody is interested. But under those circumstances, so long as you have a state, you see, they say does not the monitor school presuppose a state monopoly of the production of money and money certificates? No, not in the slightest. It doesn't presuppose that at all. It simply, as I said, says that in the present state of the world, and if you're going to talk about going from where you are now to where you want to go, let people be free to develop gold as an alternative, but at the same time, let's improve the operation of our present governmental monetary system, and let's improve it in the ways I've suggested by tying it into a rule. Let's not pretend, let's not make believe that by getting some kind of a fake link between the dollar and gold, some kind of words written on, I should say, golden tablets, that a dollar equals 35, that 1 ounce of gold equals $35. Do not suppose that that is going to be any kind of an effective control on the government political authorities. It has turned out not to be. Now, why is it that I predict? Now, I'm not talking about policy, not talking about what should be. I'm trying as a scientist to predict what would be. Why is it that I predict that if, in fact, you had people free to use and buy and sell gold, that you would not, in fact, move toward a 100% gold currency? And the reason is because as I look over the record of history, when that option has been open in the past, it has never been accepted. People have moved away from it, and the reason is because it is expensive to furnish such a currency. There's a cheaper substitute, pieces of paper. And the market forces lead people to produce pieces of paper. One of the things that always baffles me about the way some people tend to interpret statements by myself and others is their apparent inability to separate predictions from prescriptions. Because I say and have said that in practice it is a fact that it costs money, it costs resources to dig gold out of the ground, that there is therefore a private incentive to produce cheaper substitutes, and that therefore cheaper substitutes will emerge. I'm predicting what's happening. I'm not saying at that stage whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. That's not an endorsement of it. It's not saying that's desirable. Question is it really sensible, does it make sensible to say that it is desirable for people to behave in a way in which they will not in fact behave? That's a little kind of a difficult problem, isn't it? Now, maybe it would be desirable if everybody in the world did want to have a pure gold standard and was willing to stick to it. But if you were temporarily to institute one, it would not last. these forces I've described would, in my opinion, lead it to break down. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. You could have free banking. That has much more to be said for it than a pure gold standard on that level, because at least it's got a ghost of a show of working and holding. But I think free banking, in the sense of anybody being free to make any deals he wants with anybody else about borrowing money from him and the terms on which he'll turn it back, makes a good deal of sense. It also has raised social problems at various times in the past, and every time you've had some element of emerge, it has in fact not left. I think it's important for people who are going to develop prescriptions for the ideal world also to have some understanding of the way in which the world does in fact operate. If scientific knowledge is a prerequisite for fashioning intelligent, sensible, and reliable prescriptions.
We're going to take 2 questions from California at this point.
We can't hear him.
Let's take another question.
What he's saying. So I'm going to turn over the mic to. Hey, we've got how many questions, Don? 2. Okay. First question will be asked by Roy Child. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Dr. Friedman, I'd like to ask you what you think of praxeology as a methodology in economic science, and what you think of the work of Mises and Rothbard in economics.
Well, that's a big question, and I'll give my usual academic 50-minute lecture on it, but I'll try to cut it down to 3. Let me separate those questions. First of all, I think Ludwig von Mises has done some extraordinarily good work in economics. I think he's a first-rate economist who is obviously one of the leading figures of our science. I do not agree with his methodological doctrine of praxeology, and I do not believe that Dr. von Mises does either. In the sense that if I examine his writings in economics, which are not methodological, if I examine what he has written in the field of money or in other fields, he does not stick to his methodological doctrine. Now, why do I object to the doctrine of praxeology? Because that doctrine is fundamentally a doctrine which does not admit differences among people to be resolved. The doctrine of praxeology says that we can deduce things about the way the world will behave from the fact that we are human beings and we know ourselves. Well, I assume almost all of us would recognize that Freud and his fellows have lived in vain if there remains somebody who thinks we know ourselves. But entirely aside from that, which is really not the relevant comment, the problem arises as this. Let's suppose that my introspection leads me to a different answer than your introspection. How do we resolve that difference? Well, you may say, you talk some more. We can talk some more. We talk indefinitely. And although we have talked a long time, we still have a difference between ourselves in which my introspection leads to a different answer than your introspection. Well, in that case, I would like to believe that maybe we can resolve our difference by asking, what difference does it make that we differ in this respect? What are the implications of this difference? If you're right, what would you expect to observe in the world? If I'm right, what would I expect to observe in the world? And then we can go out and look, and maybe we can resolve this difference, and maybe therefore we can get some agreement and go on to the next point. Whereas if you insist that the only relevant basis for judgments about the real world are your internal logical introspections of yourself, then you're driven to the point in which intellectual and scientific discussion becomes you're right, I'm right, you're right, I'm right, you're right, I'm right. There is no way of resolving it. Beyond this, the notion that you can, in fact, by introspection, make statements about the real world does not seem to me to hold substance. The problem is
that there are no small number of things that are true about myself. There are an infinite number of things that are true about all of us as human beings. The real problem in any practical case is what are the dominant influences. There are 1,001 influences. Many other people are influenced by many other things. There are forces that work in one direction or in the other direction. How do I know? By looking into my self, into my soul, how do I know that the particular forces which seem to me important will in fact dominate the other? The essence of all scientific propositions is that they are trying to predict, they are trying to make statements capable of being contradicted from partial knowledge. If I have to have full knowledge of anything, I'm hopeless. Full knowledge is infinite. If I really have to know every single feature of this steel object I'm holding up before I can guess how long it's going to take to drop to the floor, well, then I'll never know that, because I have to know who produced it, where he produced it, what his ancestors were, and so on. Those are all parts of this phenomenon. And so the question of science is, what are the dominant influences? And I'll illustrate for you for a moment when I say that I think in important respects Professor von Mises has not really used praxeology in his economic analysis. He has a theory of the business cycle, which involves a notion that there is a lengthening of the period of production as a result of forced saving imposed on people by monetary expansion and credit expansion. Now, in the course of the business cycle, there are lots and lots of things that happen. Let's suppose for a moment this happens. Let's suppose that by introspection I could make clear that this is likely to happen. How do I know, by introspection, that that's going to be the dominant force and that other things aren't going to be still more important? William Stanley Jevons observed that there were sunspots on the sun with cycles of a period roughly equal to what he thought were the periods of domestic cycles, of business cycles. And he constructed a perfectly logical theory to link the one with the other. He said sunspots affect growing conditions on Earth. Growing conditions on Earth affect the size of the crop. The size of the crop affects the economy. And so you have business cycles which originate in agricultural cycles. There's nothing wrong with that as a logical theory. How do I know by standing here and searching my soul that that theory is inferior to the Misesian theory of lengthening the period of production, of distortions in the production? I can't possibly know that. I have to ask myself in scientific fashion, what are the implications of Mises' theory? What are the implications of Jevons' theory? Do the facts conform to the one or to the other? Now, Jevons' theory was disproved by a certain class of implications. I believe that the Mises theory has been disproved by a certain class of implications. There are different classes of implications. But more important, why did Mises come up with that theory? Why did he come up with a theory from his introspection of the Jevons type, or still another type? There are lots of distortions that will happen during a cycle. The answer, I believe, historically would be very simple. Students of business cycles early discovered that investment spending fluctuated by a wider amplitude than consumer spending. And so Mises was quite naturally led to ask himself, and behaving as a true and productive scientist in doing so, how could I explain that greater fluctuation of investment? And he brought up a theory which was a perfectly rational and reasonable explanation of it, which doesn't mean it was right. We all know if there's one explanation of a set of phenomena, there are lots of others, and the way in which we test explanations is by seeing what additional implications they have, which may or may not be contradictory. So my main answer is that I think praxeology is a methodology that makes it impossible for people to resolve differences, that tend to lead to people engaging in doctrinaire shouting matches instead of in investigating experience and evidence in order to be able to progress by looking at the facts, and that it is not, in fact, a reliable technique for producing testable economic hypotheses with substantive content. Now, I think that's probably enough to reply to that. There was a question about Rothbard. Let me take this opportunity first to say that I am baffled by Murray Rothbard. He wrote an article in a publication whose name I forget, which attributed to me ideas and views which I do not hold, have never held, and which are flatly contradicted by things that I have written. Now, how could he do that? Murray is not a stupid man, he's a very smart man. I cannot believe that it was impossible for him to understand what I had written. Murray, as I am sure an honest man, I am sure he would not deliberately have misrepresented what I said. And yet he did in fact do so. And the only way I can interpret that is by the corrupting influence of praxeology. Because his introspection tells him what I should have said. And therefore he doesn't have to look at what I did say. That would be violating the principle of praxeology. I may go on to say that the publication which published that article, which grossly misrepresented my views, has refused to publish a number of articles which have been submitted by other people trying to correct the record. Now, that ought to say something about the value of that publication. It's a property right of the people who own that publication to publish whatever they want in it. But it's appropriate also for consumer information to be available about the extent of tolerance which the editors of that magazine show to views and the willingness which they have to correct mistaken statements in their own columns. Yes, I know, but my price is too high for you.
John, do you have a second question?
Oh yes, one more from California. I'll try to make the answer shorter if you can make the question easier.
We don't care how long you take to answer this. And this question is being asked by Don Frank from the Action Coalition for Freedom.
He has some friends here anyway.
You commented during the course of your talk on the difficulty of establishing a fully voluntaristic society or an anarchist society, and two factors you alluded to were the non-marketability of certain goods, in particular national defense, and the phenomenon of high negotiation costs. Now, my question is this strictly a problem that is present today because the context that we have, namely a context with a government and negotiating costs that derive from legal structure therein? And secondly, does your analysis, or do you think that we can eliminate the possibility or the value of moving toward a society in which contractual agreements will largely replace the coercive agreements, the coercive situation we have today?
Well, the answer to that is in two parts. Number one, needless to say, I would like to see us move in many areas to eliminate the coercive interventions on government, which cannot be justified on the grounds that I was trying to justify. And that's why I was saying earlier, so far as the practical agenda for action is concerned, there really is no real difference between the most extreme libertarian anarchist and myself. We can very quickly get up a long list of things which government is now doing, which both of us would agree cannot be justified and should not be done. And if after we've eliminated those, we come to the next stage, and if there are some which I think can't be eliminated, which you can prove can be, fine, all to the good. But I don't believe that the problem that I raised does derive solely from the historical context. Not at all. I believe it derives from the fact that there are and always will be some things which cannot be determined strictly by market arrangement, and that it will be useful for us, that it will be in the self-interest of all of us to establish institutions of a kind that we now call government, which will resolve some of those issues which cannot be decided by market arrangements alone. Let me illustrate. There's a problem of what you mean by property rights. Now, that's not a self-defining term by any manner or means whatsoever, and nor is it one that can be decided once and for all. If I own a piece of land, and and somebody flies over it at 10 feet above ground level, you and I will both think that my property rights have been violated. If somebody flies over it at 3 miles above ground level, have my property rights been violated? Could that have been provided for when the property rights were initially established before the invention of the airplane? Would it have been? are there not always new developments that are going to arise which cannot? This is what I mean when I say there's not enough fine print in the world. What you have to do in order to get around such problems is to have all contracts include provisions for arbitrating disagreements. And now there's the question at the point at which it's possible in some cases, and we now do have many such arrangements which do not involve government arbitration. You have private arbitrators, and there's no reason why you can't. And no doubt it could be extended very much further. But may it not be convenient, and I believe it is, and will turn out to be desirable and convenient, to have a certain class of such arrangements say that these rules, these specifications, will be general provisions to be written into all contracts unless explicitly rejected, as embodied in a general code, which at an earlier time grew up through the common law, some of which may be legislated, and so on. That's the kind of thing where I don't really believe it is a question of the historical context that has produced the difficulty of contractual arrangement, but where it is the inherent character of the problem that has produced it. Question. Do you think that President Nixon is explicitly aware that the apparent success of the wage price controls will last until the 1972 elections are over? If so, do you think he is purposely undermining the economy in order to be reelected? No, I do not think he is purposely undermining the economy in order to be reelected. I disagree very strongly with Mr. Nixon on this policy, but that's a very different statement. You know, I'll ask you, one of the things that's fascinating to me is, as I put it somewhere else, I'm really quoting my friend Alan Wallace, who used this image. If 75% of the people of a country believe in witchcraft, can a popularly democratically elected government refrain from practicing witchcraft? If you say if 75% isn't enough, make it 90%. Well, now, the situation with respect to wage and price controls is that it's the economic equivalent of witchcraft. But apparently 75% of the country believes in it. Mr. Nixon, I think, showed a great deal of independence in holding off the imposition of income policy and wage and price control as long as he did. I am morally certain that if it had not been for Mr. Nixon's own experience during World War II and the OPA, his own strong aversion to wage and price controls, I am morally convinced that you would have had them in effect a year earlier. Now, I wish they had been held off longer, obviously. But I think it is a travesty to accuse him of purposely undermining the economy in order to be reelected. He held off as long as he thought it was politically feasible. What triggered his coming off, as you recognize, the great bulk of the opinion makers in this country were in favor of wage and price controls on both the Democratic side and the Republican side. It was not a decision that Mr. Nixon forced down the reluctant throats of the rest of the population. It was one to which he was dragged kicking and screaming rather than the other way around. Now, I think that President Nixon has unquestionably viewed price and wage controls as a temporary measure to be eliminated as soon as possible, as soon, that is, as the rate of inflation has come down to a much lower level. However, just as 2 years ago it was never his intention to impose wage and price controls, and just as now it is not his intention to continue them beyond that point, I am afraid that the actual political and social forces will induce him, will lead to the result that they will be continued beyond that point. And in fact, I must say I have very mixed feelings about that, and I really don't know how to react myself. Look, put yourself in, let's suppose for a moment that my scenario is right. I don't say it is, but let's for a moment assume it is. And now here it is, December 1972. It looks as if the wage and price controls have worked like a dream. That's what it looks like. There are lots of grumbling and people who don't like it and so on, but on the whole, the rate of price inflation has come down, and the general tendency to say post hoc ergo hoc will lead people to say, well, price controls work. And now, from one point of view, you might say, well, that's a wonderful time, let's abolish them. But if you abolished them then, what would happen? Everybody would bear away the view price and wage controls are a wonderful cure. The next time you got the slightest burst of inflation, you'd be absolutely certain to have wage and price controls back before you could say 2 words. On the other hand, I think what's really going to happen is that they will not be eliminated, that they will be continued, and then their flaws will show, that they will collapse, that you will have inflation develop, you will have a conflict between the union members and the others, and it's really a kind of an ironic commentary on the world that the believers in free enterprise have to depend on the union. But they will save us, in this case, I believe. And let's say in late 1973, the whole thing collapses with a very bad odor to wage and price control. Now, which of those should you and I be arguing for? As I say, I think that leaves us in something of a dilemma. Question. Wouldn't even a fixed growth in the money supply distort interest rates and therefore generate business malinvestment? Why not advocate a zero growth in the money supply as an ultimate goal? The answer to the first question is plainly no. And the problem with the person who wrote this is that he has not distinguished, as Irving Fisher did in 1896, let's see, that's 3/4 of a century ago, he has not distinguished between nominal and real interest rates. A steady fixed rate of growth in the money supply, whatever it is, let it be 25% a year. And let's suppose that's associated with a rate of price rise of 20% a year. And let's say everybody knows that. Then the nominal interest rate would be 25%. The real interest rate would still be 5%. The interest rate that would be relevant to investment would be the 5% and not the 25%. Inflation distorts the interest rate and therefore generates business malinvestment if and only if it is unanticipated. It's the unexpected inflation. And therefore the answer to that first part is no. In Dollars and Deficits, you stated that you thought the American economy was depression-proof because depressions are caused by deflation and that the government would not cause a deflation. But isn't a devaluation the same as a deflation? No, a devaluation is not the same as a deflation. It has nothing to do. It may be associated with inflation. It may be associated with deflation. A devaluation, first place, the word devaluation is widely used in 2 wholly different senses. The important sense is the price of the American dollar with respect to other currencies. The number of German marks it takes to buy a dollar, the number of French francs it takes to buy a dollar, the number of yen it takes to buy a dollar. In that sense, a devaluation means an increase in the number of foreign units that it takes to buy a dollar. If it takes 400 yen to buy a dollar instead of 360 yen, then the dollar is devalued, has suffered a devaluation, and the Japanese yen has suffered an appreciation. They've both experienced one devaluation. That's not the same as deflation at all. By a deflation, in the first place, let me go back. I did not state that the American economy was depression-proof because depressions are caused by deflation and the government would not cause a deflation. I never said that. What I did say was that the U.S. economy was depression-proof because the depression was caused by a sharp contraction in the quantity of money, which aids in state collection of income theft. And if so, what are the limits of that responsibility, and to what extent, if any of you, recanted? It's good for the soul, isn't it? I was an employee of the U.S. Treasury Department in 1941 to 43 during the early stages of World War II, and in that respect, I did have some responsibility for developing and the technique of withholding, for arguing for it before congressional committees, and for designing the techniques of withholding. Now, what's the extent of that responsibility? Well, I was in 1941. I was 29 years old. I obviously was not the head of I was not yet, and still am not, the Secretary of the Treasury, thank God. So my responsibility was that of one of the economists who played a role, and I would say a not insignificant role, in the technical development of the scheme and in helping to sell it to Congress, to the Congressional Committee. Now, that's as best I can say about the limits of my responsibility. I believe that was a desirable measure for the war. In the conditions of World War II, when we were faced with a war, which at that time and in retrospect, I approved of, in the sense that I approved of our participation in it. And again, maybe that was wrong. I'm not saying that that was necessarily right, but I'm trying to be as responsive as I can to this question. I believe that the withholding was a desirable move as part of the program of wartime finance. I think it is an undesirable thing in ordinary times, because I do think that it reduces people's awareness of the taxes they pay, and therefore enables government to collect taxes without people being aware that they are paying taxes. And therefore I think, from the peacetime point of view of post-1945, it would have been better not to have introduced it. Now, I do not know in my own mind or in anybody else's mind what I should have done in 41, even if I had, well, obviously, if you knew that you were going to win the war independently of whether you did that, that makes it easy, but you can't know that. And even knowing what I know now and having the feelings that I have now, I cannot honestly say that if I were doing it over again under the conditions of World War I would behave any differently. Where does a social collective, for example, government, get the right to do that which no individual has the right to do? For example, a tax. It doesn't. A social collective has no right to do anything individuals don't have a right to do. The question at issue is a very different one. Do we have a right to get together jointly and agree to have some collective activity? That's a much different and a much harder question. And the question you see, you mustn't try to get easy answers to hard questions. You mustn't suppose that you can make the world over in your image. There are real hard problems in the world, and face up to them. And one of those hard problems is that there are some things which it is extremely difficult, impossible, or costly to do through voluntary market arrangements. That it is not always obviously the best thing of all, when you cannot do it through voluntary market arrangements, is to do it through voluntary groups, entry and exit from which is open and easy. And that is the ground on which I and all other believers in free society have always been in favor of freedom of immigration and emigration, have always preferred that any governmental actions be taken at as local a level as possible, so that people can have an opportunity to choose what area they're going to go into, and have wanted to limit the amount that has to be taken at the national level to as little as possible. But don't just dream your problems away. What do you think of Harry Brown's thesis that there will necessarily be a depression because of the great inflation since 1940? I have not read Harry Brown's theory, but as I've already implied, I do not believe the conclusion is correct. I do not believe, first of all, I thought some of the people who held the kinds of views that this question come from thought there was something to the notion of free will. And then what does this mean? That there will necessarily be a depression because of the great inflation. If we have some control over our destiny, whether there will be a depression or not depends on what policy we follow from here on out, not merely what's happened in the past. In the second place, a great inflation does not necessarily, there's not even a probability that it will be followed by a depression. In fact, the interesting thing empirically is, I said earlier that there was some empirical evidence I thought which was rather strong against the Misesian theory of cycles. I think one of the implications of the Misesian theory of cycles is that great inflations ought to be followed by big depressions, and that small inflations ought to be followed by small depressions. That is to say, that the more rapid the rate of the expansion, the sharper ought to be the following contraction. Well, empirically, there is no evidence that there's any such connection. What seems to be the case is that a deep contraction is followed by a sharp expansion. There's a high serial correlation between the amplitude of a contraction and the amplitude of the succeeding expansion. But there is no correlation between the amplitude of an expansion and the size of the succeeding contraction. It's as if the image that gives you the right idea is to think of taking a string along here and plucking it every now and then. Sometimes you pluck it deep, and then you'll have a deep fall and a high rise. Sometimes you'll pluck it shallow, and you have a shallow fall and a shallow rise. That's the way business cycles are, empirically, historically. They tend to redound up to this level of full employment, full reutilization of resources. If they're driven way down behind it, they rebound sharply. But it's not true that if they rise sharply, they necessarily fall sharply. And so I don't really think very much of this theory. How can the government prevent a runaway inflation following the lifting of price and wage freeze? By not increasing the quantity of money too much. If it can't, won't a depression follow? I believe it will be impossible to stop the inflation without a slowdown, a recession. This is a question of words. I think you may have to have a recession after you have had a burst of inflation. I do not think you have to have a major depression of the 29 to 33 kind, and there's all the difference in the world between a major catastrophe like 29 to 33, which never had to happen, which never should have happened. There's all the difference in the world between that. And even a fairly severe recession, like 57, 58, 60, 61, those are quite different phenomena. In yesterday's Times, Wolfgang Friedman replied to a previous article of yours. What was the date of your article and what is your rejoinder to his? The date of my article was October 28th and 29th in the op-ed page of the New York Times. My rejoinder to his is that I really believe he hasn't replied to me, so. In fact, I tell you, I really don't want to go into a detailed rejoinder, but he made one comment which amused me very much. Because he said that if you carried through the logic of my idea that the price and wage controls were immoral, well, then you would have to conclude that laws against usury were also immoral. And I certainly agree with his logic. And so does Jeremy Bentham from his grave. You said that morality does not consist of obeying all laws and that morality does not consist of violating all laws. But you ducked the question, is it or is it not immoral to violate laws like tariffs, wage price freezes, the dress? I'm not going to, if I duck that, I'm going to continue to duck it. I am not a moral philosopher. I am a poor, simple economist. And I believe moral decisions are decisions that people have to make for themselves. And I am not about to stand up here and tell you what it is or is not moral for you to do. That depends on your feelings, your attitude, and your circumstances. In my opinion, in my view, if I believe I am a member of a society in which I am participating and I have had a role to play, I think there's a presumption in favor of my obeying any law, even if I think it's bad, so long as I can continue to work to get it changed and to get a new law put in. On the other hand, if I am a member of a society in which I disagree fundamentally, as for example, if I were a member in Germany, if I were a resident of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, I would not have regarded myself as in a position where I was part of that community. I would resign, as it were, from that community, and my moral attitudes would be very different. Well, I cannot tell any individual what's moral for him to do. Who am I to tell him? Do you favor a negative income tax because the poor deserve our money or because it is an efficient way to solve other problems? Neither. People have often berated me. I just had a letter the other day from a student up here in New York who said, now, how can you consistently hold the view that poor people have a right to a minimum standard of living? And the answer is I cannot consistently hold that view. I never have held it. To the best of my knowledge, I have never stated anything of the kind. The poor do not deserve anything in particular, any more than you or I deserve anything in particular. But some of us may feel that we would want to do something to help out the poor. That's a very different situation. And I prefer, again, this depends on where you start from. If you are starting from a world in which there were no governmental measures of welfare or of relief, I do not know for a moment whether I would be in favor of a negative income tax. I would hope that the problems of poverty and of indigence could be resolved by private charity and by the generosity of individuals. But that's not the world we're in now. We now do have an enormous mess of governmental programs that profess to help the poor and do not in fact do so. I would like to get away from that system. I would like to get to a system in which we can reduce the number of people who are on beneficiaries of, well, I shouldn't say that. You see, under the present circumstances, it's not only the poor who feed at the public trough. It's a lot of other people. All of us, you and I here, those of you who are, I wonder whether the people who wrote this question have felt it moral to turn back to the state the subsidy they've been receiving for their education. We live in a system in which we have to accept the imperfections and the parts of that system, and we always have to ask ourselves the question, we want to have ideals of where we want to go, but how do we get from here to there? And I would like to move in a direction of a society in which there is less reliance on governmental assistance and charity, and in which we eliminate the present demeaning, demoralizing, direct relief and welfare program. And I have always believed that the negative income tax was the only feasible means for getting out of the present mess, getting from here to there. I do not believe that you can just stop and end the welfare system. You've got people whom you have induced and seduced, if you want to put it, to live on government bounty, and you can't simply say, now I'm going to throw you out in the street. You and I, as citizens and as taxpayers, have a responsibility not to do that. And so the question is, how do you dismantle this present mess and get it over into a decent kind of a system? And I've always argued for the negative income tax as the most effective way of doing it. It doesn't mean that any negative income tax will do it. I oppose, publicly and in print, the particular version of the negative income tax that was passed in the family, got through the House Ways and Means Committee a year ago in the Family Assistance Plan. The reason is because that particular negative income tax was not an effective way of getting from where you are to where you would like to be, because it had an 80% marginal tax rate and therefore did not give people an incentive to get off the welfare rolls. So I think that's more or less an answer to that. In your discussion of gold, you did not mention the legal tender laws. Do you believe that they are justified? When you say the legal tender laws, I'm not sure quite whether what is intended. Does the person who wrote the question mean the expression on here, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private? If that's what he means, the answer to that is that all that says is that if you agree to give anybody $1, this is $1. It doesn't have any other meaning or significance to that. You could take that expression off of here and it would have negligible effect on anything. Or do you mean the laws in the 1860s, the legal tender acts in the 1860s, the Greenback Act, which permitted the government to print greenbacks? I'm not sure which he means. I really don't know how to answer this. Obviously, I believe the government does have the right to print pieces of paper, and if people want to accept them as dollars, people have the right to accept them as such. I think that it also has the right to prevent counterfeiting of those dollars, but I would like to see it leave open the possibility of people using other kinds of money if they wish to do so, which is a different question. To what extent do bad national policies depend on ignorance or bad logic, or to help moneyed interest in consolidated power? In short, is there a ruling class or just bad planning? I'm not sure either of those alternatives exhausts the range. In fact, I think neither one is right. There is obviously a great deal of ignorance. There is obviously a great deal of bad logic. It is also obviously true that given that you have governmental intervention, vested interests take it over. There isn't the slightest doubt that the Interstate Commerce Commission was run for a long time mainly for the benefit of railroads and more recently for the benefit of trucking industry interests. There isn't the slightest doubt, in my opinion, that the SEC is dominated by the securities exchange and the securities industry, that the FCC has been a bastion to protect the networks and their monopoly position. So I think it is correct that once you start on a route of governmental control, it is likely to be taken over by individual interests. But That doesn't mean there's a ruling class. That's a wholly different thing. In fact, I may say what I'm going to say now, I really owe mostly to some discussions I've had on this subject with my son David, who will be talking with you tomorrow. So I don't want him to hold him responsible for it in the sense of agreeing with what I said, but only being the source of some of what I said. And that is, he pointed out very well, I think, that you have here a fallacy of composition. That the people who own the airlines are, on the one hand, benefited by the CAB monopolistic strengthening the monopoly of airlines, but they're the very same ones who pay the higher fares. That in general, if you look at most of these programs, which involve what look like government benefits for particular interests, you have the typical situation is that the government spends $10 in order to make somebody $1 better off. For example, if you take the agricultural subsidy, most of that money is used to pay for bigger fertilizer, for more fertilizer, or for more equipment to grow crops. And no, the farmer doesn't benefit from that. Most of the rest of it has gone into higher land prices. And the present person who buys the land now doesn't benefit from that. Somebody else benefited a long time ago. Or if you take governmental, for example, consider the case of the petroleum industry, where you are probably making the cost of petroleum something like $5 billion a year higher to consumers by reason of restricting the import of oil by the Texas Railroad Commission's pro-rationing actions in Texas and so on. It's very doubtful that the profits of the oil industries are up by more than a tiny, tiny fraction of that, maybe $100 or $200 million. Again, you look at percentage depletion. There's no justification for it. And yet, it doesn't really make the people who own oil wells any better off. It just means there are more oil wells. Because if you now tend to make it more profitable, well, then people will explore more, and most of the cash from that doesn't go into anybody's pocket, but just benefits, but it's just wasted. And so it's probable that if all of these so-called moneyed classes and invested classes could get together and make a joint agreement to make a bonfire of the whole collection of these controls, they'd all be better off. And in that sense, there is no ruling class. There is no class which has a clear-eyed view of its own self-interest. I'm always getting from a different class of nuts. The best people, that's not a pejorative term in my vocabulary. I regard myself as a nut, and the best people are nuts. But there's another class of nuts who are monetary nuts who are always writing to me. And they are absolutely persuaded that there is an international banking conspiracy, which starts with the Rothschilds and a couple of other firms, which established the Warburgs. That's right, Felix Warburg was part of it, and they established the Federal Reserve System as part of their long-sighted plan to take over the world. Now, I think the Federal Reserve System has done an enormous amount of harm. If any intelligent ruling class had had control of it, they would have been insane to run it that way. It wouldn't have been in their own interest to do so. So I think the evidence is very clear that that kind of a ruling class attitude is wrong. And similarly, I think the idea underlying this is also wrong. That if there be a ruling class in any sense, that ruling class are the intellectuals, who have been deciding what other people think. It's the business. I speak to businessmen often, and I tell them over and over again, you think you're defending free enterprise, but you're preaching socialism. And the reason they're preaching socialism is because they read the same things you do. They listen to the same papers. They have their children come back from school spouting the same nonsense. And the end result is that if there be a ruling class that is determining the way we're moving, I would say that ruling class are the intellectuals who decide our ideas, and not the people who run the ICC or the FCC or the SEC. Let's get rid of those things, of course, but they're not ruling class in that sense. If you were to dismantle federal controls over the economy, which ones would you consider the most fundamental to remove immediately? Unquestionably tariffs and quotas. There's absolutely no other thing that would do more to introduce competition into the economy that by all means would be the most effective single device. Now, where would I go next? Well, I guess next I would go to the monetary structure and substitute a constitutional provision for a steady rate of growth in the quantity of money for our present provision. And I guess third I would go to a constitutional provision which would require that the personal income tax be based on all income with no deductions except for a personal exemption and strictly occupational expenses, and that the maximum rate could not exceed twice the minimum rate. Because I think I would get rid of the kind of crazy personal and corporate income tax structure that we have. I think those would be my first three priorities. I'll just take a couple more here. Do you think that owning gold is a protection against inflation, and if so, in what way? Retrospectively, it's proved to be a very, very poor protection. If you had bought gold at any time in the last, if you had legally or illegally bought gold at any time in the last 35 years, you would have lost money on holding it to now. You would have done better even in Series E government bonds than you would have by holding gold. So in the past, it has not been a good protection against inflation in our experience. In the future, it may be a better one. Gold is a commodity. It's a commodity for which there is a very large and strong demand and a relatively small annual supply. The use of gold in the arts and in industry is increasing. I expect that the free market price of gold will rise over a long period. And in general, it would tend to rise along with the rise in the price level in general. So it's not a bad idea from that point of view. The problem is that if you get a protection against inflation, there's no provision for storage costs, for loss of interest on it. And you would do far better to hold real goods which yield income than to hold gold. And in addition, about half the supply of the outstanding stock of gold is in the hands of central banks, and that produces the uncertainty of what may happen if and when they decide to throw that on the market of the world. So I'm not sure I would think that gold was really a very, very satisfactory hedge against inflation. I think there are far better hedges. Pick out a good one for the last one. I'll take one more after that. Isn't it true that insofar as a corporation as opposed to a privately owned business depends on corporate law for its existence, the government may properly regulate it, i.e. what the government has created, the government may destroy. I may say the government may destroy things it hasn't created too. In the sense may as perhaps possible rather than may as permitted to. Of course, insofar as a corporation depends on corporate law for its very existence, it is appropriate to ask what are the best rules for a corporation. I do not see any violation of anybody's principle in saying that we will, that batch of fine print, which has been provided for once and for all in the name of the corporation, shall include these and not include those. That, for example, it has always seemed to me that there is a great deal to be said for preventing one corporation from owning another corporation, for preventing the pyramiding of corporations, the conglomerates of parts. And maybe there are other regulations. So I don't really see personally anything wrong with facing up to the question, what if you're going to have laws specifying what corporations may and may not do, what will be carried along by the notion of corporation. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to improve it. Is that a good one to end on? I think so. You blame Gary if it isn't. The person who ever wrote this, I may say one of my hobbies is handwriting, and whoever wrote this is a strongly inhibited and repressed individual. I don't know who he is, and I haven't even read a word. I'm just reading, I'm doing graphology for you, throwing in a free textbook. I've heard the following argument several times recently. You were one of President Nixon's economic advisors for 2 years. He put, parenthesis, all question, many questions, some question. I didn't realize this was a choice exam. It's a multiple choice exam. He put all question, many questions, some question of your ideas in practice, and they didn't work. That's why you're out and the wage price control nightmare is in. I did not follow your career within the Nixon administration, thus I cannot respond to the argument. Which of your ideas were implemented in what programs, and why did the implementation fail, or why was it deemed to have failed? That is a good one to end on, isn't it? If it won't end you, it'll end me. I have advised President Nixon in an informal way for 2 years. I have not had any official position within the administration. I am a private individual. I do not hold any government. Well, I've done some consulting work for the government and occasionally gotten paid a per diem, and I participate on some government commissions like the Commission for an All-Volunteer Armed Force. But thank you, because I really think that people do not, on that score, I think you don't give enough credit to Mr. Nixon's initiatives in bringing the draft to an end. Don't let me go slowly in doing that. Who appointed that commission? Who selected the members of that commission? Would he have appointed, if he had not wanted to end the draft, would he have appointed that commission? Not in a million years. He may have wanted to do it more slowly and over a slower period, but there isn't the slightest doubt. Now I speak on something I really know about. There isn't the slightest doubt. There isn't the slightest doubt that if it had not been for Mr. Nixon's initiative in taking steps to bring the draft to an end, you would be nowhere nearly as close to the end of the draft as you are now. Now that really is the fact. And you must not let differences of opinion about the pace. I wanted to go faster than he wanted to go. That's no question. There's no disagreement about that. I would have liked to have seen the thing ended, and our commission recommended that it be ended 2 years earlier than it's going to end. But it's nonetheless true that it was primarily Mr. Nixon's doing. It was his commitment during the campaign. It was his appointment of the commission. It was his approval of the particular kind of membership of the commission, which was not all one way. We started out 6 people one way and 6 people the other, and we ended up in a unanimous report, which I think speaks well also for the people who saw the truth. But at any rate, to go back, the main idea in which I think I can claim to have had some role, though I wouldn't want to overemphasize my own role in that. I think anything that happens depends on a lot of different things, and it's kind of romanticizing to hold one person responsible for many things. Was in the notion that you should try to beat inflation and solve the inflation problem by emphasizing primarily monetary and fiscal restraint, particularly monetary restraint, and by doing it gradually over a period of time, and that you should avoid going in for wage and price controls. Now, those ideas were followed to some extent. They were not 100% followed, but in 1969, we did have monetary restraint. First half of the year, not bad, and the second half of the year, I was objecting that it was being overdone, that it wasn't gradual enough. In 1970, we went too far the other way and were a little bit too expansionary. But for 69 and 70 as a whole, I have no great objection to the pace at which we did have monetary restraint under the circumstances. Now, the place where I differ most strongly with this question is in the statement that they didn't work. That's wrong. They did work. The fact is that inflation was running at the rate of about 6 to 7% a year in cost of living at the end of 1969, early part of 1970. In the middle of 1971, the cost of living index was running at the rate of 4% a year. Now that's a very substantial decline. It's not enough. We would like to get it lower, but it was a movement in the right direction. Moreover, that did produce a recession. It was the mildest recession that we have had in the post-war period, and perhaps for a very much longer period of time. It's hard to find any recession in American history that was milder than the recession of 1970. Unemployment at its peak reached 6.2%. It reached over 7% in the 1960 recession, and higher levels in the earlier recessions. So looked at objectively, I think the policy worked, and worked very well at very low cost. The recession had come to an end at the end of 1970. It was turning around and starting to come up. But people's expectations exceeded what was possible. The American people are impatient and they want instant solutions to difficult problems. And moreover, there was a political source of objections to the policy. There was I think one of the most effective snow jobs that has ever been done on the American people was a job that was done in early 1971 and mid-71 in selling the American people the idea that everything wasn't working. In selling the idea that, after all, we were in an economic crisis, that inflation was not slow, we were making no progress at all against inflation, that we were making no progress against unemployment, and so on. Now, I think that was wrong. We were not. We were doing very well. The situation as of middle 1970 was very good. And I think it was this snow job and this overwhelming pressure and the belief that something had to be done, combined with the triggering effect of the international monetary crisis that led Mr. Nixon on August 15th to chuck that policy and to turn toward the new economic policy. I don't know whether that's a full response to that question. As to the question of some of your ideas, it certainly didn't put all of my ideas in practice, that's for sure. But I guess I do have to take some responsibility for some of the aspects, indirectly, for some of the aspects of the Family Assistance Plan, which does have a negative income tax approach. He unfortunately did not put all of my ideas in practice. If he had, we would be in better shape, of course. In particular, one of the things I was most certain of was the desirability on the first week that he was in office of closing the window on gold, of eliminating the controls on foreign investment and the controls on foreign lending, and of abolishing the interest equalization tax. That is, rip away the whole system of exchange control, and at the same time end the fiction that the dollar was convertible into gold, which it was not. He did not do it then, but as a result, he was forced to do it under much less satisfactory circumstances on August 15th when he did close the window. Well, I think that's enough. Thank you.